Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's pretty exciting. We had 100 people and plus sign up for this tour. We're typically only able to take about 30 on a walking tour of St. so this is exciting for us to do. This is my first time doing this virtually, so we have a lot of photos and a lot of information that we're going to be getting through. If you could just, as Melissa mentioned, we're going to have the Q&A at the end. You can put your questions in the Q&A box. And if there are follow-up questions, there is an opportunity to raise your hand later. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Miller. I am the director of the DC Preservation League. And I'm actually going to turn my camera off so that way I can focus on my script as opposed to other things. So excuse me for one sec. Great. So my name is Rebecca Miller, as I mentioned, and I have been with the DC Preservation League since 2003. And I have been working on behalf of DCPL to preserve the St. Elizabeth's campus since 2005. In 2005, the General Services Administration began its Section 106 consultation to prepare a master plan for the consolidation of the Department of Homeland Security. Under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, it requires that any federal undertaking, this is expenditure of funds or transfer of properties, take into account the effect the undertaking would have on a historic property or historic properties within the area of potential effect. The goal of the consultation is to avoid an effect, and if avoidance is not possible, minimization and mitigation is warranted. Consulting parties are typically made up of various government agencies like the State Historic Preservation Office here in DC, and organizations like DCPL with preservation in their mission, as well as local community groups. As part of the mitigation for the West Campus Master Plan, DCPL began presenting public tours on the campus in 2008. All tours, of course, were suspended indefinitely when installations closed due to the pandemic. And also before I start, I'd like to really thank Thomas Otto, who was the historian on campus for about a decade, who did much of the research that you'll hear today. Before GSA took over this project and Thomas took on the historian factor, there were a lot of different word of mouth, a lot of lore that happened. And so Thomas really kind of dug deep to really give us a good history of the campus. So my tour today is going to go over the five different superintendents that had the most instrumental effect on this particular campus. And so we'll be going through different phases. Just one sec. There we go. So just to locate the hospital, you can see here on the red star, locating it in Southeast Washington, DC. And this is located in Ward 8 of Washington. Here is a campus map. I know it's hard to see the specific building names on the map, so we will go through them and I will reorient you throughout the presentation as I'm talking about the different periods under the different superintendents. For the first portion of this, we'll be talking about where this red circle is, primarily the center building, which is the first phase of development. Prior to the 1840s, when Dorothea Dix first began advocating for better conditions for the mentally ill, treatment and care for those with mental illness was really haphazard and really not great and inhumane. Dix brought her message of reform to Washington and convinced Congress in 1852 to provide $100,000 for the purpose of establishing the first federal mental health hospital for members of the armed forces and residents of the District of Columbia. Originally, it was named the United States Government Hospital for the Insane, and the mission of the hospital was to provide the most humane care and enlightened curative treatment. Here you see an 1839 tract map of the property. The location for the hospital was chosen for its capacity to support the philosophy of care promoted by Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, a Philadelphia physician who extolled the value of moral treatment or humane care of the mentally ill. Dix and Dr. Charles Nichols, the first superintendent of the hospital, chose the St. Elizabeth site because it was located far enough from the city on a hill overlooking the Anacostia River. It offered vast views and vistas, natural surroundings, and plenty of space for physical activity and passive recreation. The problem, however, was that the land wasn't for sale. And just to step back for a second, as I mentioned earlier, the St. Elizabeth's campus is a National Historic Landmark, and the three major contributing factors to that is not only the buildings, but also the landscape and the view sheds. The owner of the property was Thomas Blagden Sr., who had a successful lumber business here in Washington and owned many tracts of land in the District of Columbia. You may be familiar with Blagden Alley. Dix lobbied Blagden and wouldn't take no for an answer, actually, and she was relentless, and Blagden finally agreed. He wrote to Dix in a letter saying, "Since seeing you today, I have had no other opinion, and Mrs. Blagden also, than that I must not stand between you and the beloved farm, regarding you as I do, as the instrument in the hands of God to secure this very spot for the unfortunates whose best earthly blessing will not rest on nor abide with those who may place obstacles in your way." The government paid $25,000 for 185 acres. A consultant on the project, Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, who was the founding president of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, a precursor to the American Psychiatric Association, believed that the ideal hospital building should be laid out so that the superintendent's office and quarters and other administrative functions were housed in a central building with symmetrical linear wings for patient wards extending from its two sides. This linear plan would allow each of the patient's rooms to have unobstructed exterior views and make it so that no patient's room overlooked another patient's room. The organization of the building into wings would improve the ability to segregate patients based on the severity and type of their mental illness. Kirkbride also advised that the most disturbed patients should be located on the ground floor at the furthest point from the center of the building. Nichols made one significant change to Kirkbride's basic linear building layout by adding a perpendicular wing between each ward as they stepped back. And you can see that here, that it steps back even further. Adding the connecting hallway allowed for better interior circulation and access for staff going from ward to ward, and was a departure from the typical Kirkbride building layout at the time. Nichols's sketches for the layout of the hospital were given to Thomas Eustick Walter, the fourth architect of the Capitol, who came to Washington in 1851 to oversee the extension of the Capitol building, which consisted of adding the wings of the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as construction of the new cast iron dome. Nichols wanted the main hospital building to be positioned to take advantage of the views of the river, the city, and the surrounding countryside. He tasked Walter with blending architectural beauty with practical function. Construction of the center building began in 1852, and Dr. Nichols essentially served as general contractor for all the building projects that went on during the 25 years at St. Elizabeth's. He stretched every penny that was appropriated to the hospital, firing nearly 9 million bricks on site by 1860. Laboring class patients were employed to dig clay to be fired in the on-site brick kilns. Various tree species were found on site and were utilized in the furnishings of patient wards in the main hospital building. Each ward was named for the wood it was finished with. You can see from this diagram where it discusses on the first floor, you have the center building in the center. And then you also have here, first floor, walnut ward, maple ward, poplar ward, and it gives cherry ward, chestnut. So you can see how they name the different wards after the different wood finishings. Between January, so the US government hospital actually admitted its first patient, Thomas Sefford, in January 1855, even though the building was far from complete. Little is known about Mr. Sefford except that he was of English birth and diagnosed with dementia. Between January and March 1855, 53 patients were transferred to the hospital, one of whom was the first criminally insane patient, Richard Lawrence, who was found not by reason of insanity for his failed assassination attempt of President Andrew Jackson in 1835. This here is a ground plan from the 1860 annual report. And what you can see here is the main hospital building. You can also see the lodge for colored men. and the Lodge for Colored Women. This is also machine shops. These still exist today, and the stable building. Excuse me, I'm sorry, these do not actually exist today, but this right here, the stable building was torn down during the third phase of development. Here also is a topographic plan for the grounds from the 1860 annual report. And you can see the layout of the campus and the meandering paths here. You can also see the agricultural aspects of it, where they have plots of land for their farming activities. The hospital was chronically overpopulated and underfunded. And with just 3 days before the Civil War starting at Fort Sumter, Dr. Nichols wrote to Dorothea Dix, who remained influential in the field and with the hospital until her death in 1887, agreeing to her request that they allow the use of parts of the government hospital for sick soldiers. Nichols was adamant that no appropriation dollars that he received would be spent on this effort. And he also asserted that he would need to have control of the hospital because once they stepped outside the confines of the East Wing that they would be inhabiting, it was hard to discern a resident from a soldier. The Navy also took up residence in the West Lodge. If patients from the Army or Navy hospitals were found to be insane, they wouldn't just be transferred from one ward to another. They would officially be discharged from the military hospital and moved next door to the West Wing to be admitted to the mental hospital. And here's the center building around 1900 and some interior photographs for you to see of the hallways, individual patient rooms, and patient rooms that had multiple beds in them. Again, additional hallway areas and the sitting room. Between November 2nd, 1861 and April 29th, 1864, about 1,900 soldiers were admitted to the Army Hospital. The vast majority were treated for the battle wounds, but illnesses like typhoid, bronchitis, pneumonia, and syphilis were also prevalent. The most notable patient to receive care at the Army Hospital was Major General Joseph Hooker, commander of the 1st Army Corps of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker had been shot in the foot at the Battle of Antietam. He was admitted on September 21st, 1862, and remained at the hospital until he returned to duty on November 11th, 1862. Beginning in April 1863, soldiers whose legs had been amputated began arriving at St. Elizabeth's from their other military hospitals in the region. The influx was the result of a decision made earlier in the year to open a prosthetic limb shop in the East Wing. The patent holder for the artificial limb shop, R.W. Jewett, took up residence on site. The Army Hospital was discontinued in June of 1864 and the Navy the following year. Nichols, however, noted that the makeup of the patient population had changed dramatically, seeing an increase in violent cases that he blamed on the war. During the war, a cemetery was established to the northwest of the center building. Approximately 250 soldiers from the Civil War are buried here, both Union and Confederate, African American, and Caucasian. Another 400 patients are also buried in the cemetery. Because of erosion and lack of maintenance over many decades, many of the stones had slid down the slope. All are now upright, but may not correspond to the individual buried below. In 1869, the government bought a 145-acre farm across the road from the hospital campus from the superintendent, Nichols, and Alexander Boss Shepherd, who was a Washington politician. They paid $23,000, and it created quite a scandal with charges of self-enrichment while they felt that patients were being neglected. Nichols did survive this investigation with little more than a requirement to change certain accounting practices and to include the produce of the farm in the annual reports to Congress. And here you can see the center building. This is Nichols Avenue here, the East Campus that was purchased. And this is Stevens Farm, which is located to the south, which also was purchased. Here are some buildings from Nichols's era that are still standing. We have the Gatehouse that was built in 1874. It's also the time when the wall was built. And also the East Lodge for African American women was built in 1861. Here are some buildings that were built during Nichols' era that are demolished at this point. The West Lodge for African American males, which was built in 1856 and demolished in 1898. And the West Campus stables that I mentioned earlier that were built in 1855 and demolished in 1901. The second major phase of development were during Dr. William Whitney Godding's years as superintendent. He was chosen when Dr. Nichols left St. Elizabeth's in 1877. Godding previously worked as an assistant physician at St. Elizabeth's years before. Godding inherited a dying construction program, a chronic overcrowding, having more than 800 patients with a hospital meant to have just 563. Like his predecessor, Godding had been pressing for a congressional appropriation to build a new women's hospital building on the east campus of the hospital. Female patients were severely outnumbered by the male patients, causing limitations to their freedoms when leaving the confines of the hospital buildings. Both superintendents felt that establishing a separate hospital building would allow for more freedom and security for the female patients. Godding found little interest by Congress to provide such funds and started asking for smaller and smaller amounts. He eventually secured enough funding to build Atkins Hall. And the Relief Building was also built. Both moved several hundred men out of the center building to a cottage-type building. Although originally temporary in nature, these buildings allowed Godding to increase capacity on a fraction of the cost of a new Kirkbride building. In 1882, the home building was built when legislation was passed moving mentally ill patients from the Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, now the Armed Forces Retirement Home, to St. Elizabeth's. In 1883, Godding joined the Reformist National Association for the Protection of the Insane and the Prevention of Insanity and became a national advocate for the utilization of the cottage plan, that under it, the patient would enjoy no more liberty nor domestic or family feeling than under the present system. Not only did Godding never ask for funds for another Kirkbride building, but he followed up on his initial 3 cottage buildings with a series of additional detached buildings for various classes of patients. We had Dix 1 and 2 for female epileptics, white female epileptics. There was also a Dix 3 for African American female epileptics. Oaks 1 and 2 for white male epileptics. This is the Toner building, and it was designed for an infirmary. And then there's Allison buildings 1 through 4. And these were built as an extension for extension functions of the home building. Here you can see in this plan, if you follow my cursor, this cottage plan activity right here. Godding also built Howard Hall for the criminally insane, which he considered to be a detached building which promises the most for the future comfort and welfare of the hospital. Prior to construction of Howard, St. Elizabeth's had no appropriate accommodations for criminally insane. Keeping the criminally insane in wards with other patients was less than optimal, and Godding explained the situation in his annual report to Congress in 1887, stating that to 9 perfectly harmless, insane persons, we added 1 dangerous lunatic, and we must build bars around them all. The addition of Howard Hall improved the hospital's efficiency by removing the most dangerous of their own to their own building. When Howard Hall was completed in 1891, it had 120 single rooms for the criminally insane. And as you can see here on the picture on your right, the interior of the walls they tended crops as well. A slew of support buildings were added during Godding's tenure, and one of the most important during this time was the detached dining hall that would serve 600 patients at once. The creation of the dining room also allowed former ward-based dining rooms to be turned into patient quarters for additional 100 beds. This particular building was also utilized for functions in the hospital, such as dances and celebrations. You can see on the right-hand side where it's decorated for the 4th of July celebration. This building is now currently being used as the mess for the Department of Homeland Security, and so it is their cafeteria as well. Other important buildings constructed under Godding were the Mortuary or Rest Building, which would form the nucleus of the pathology department, as well as a firehouse, greenhouses, several cottages on the East Campus for farm laborers, and a barn for hay and milk cows, which you can see here on the right. An ice plant was built in 1892. This is the only stone building on the campus. And you can see here the interior of the ice house building. In some cases, the support buildings did not always keep pace with the expansion of the hospital. As of 1896, the patient population numbered 1,735. Godding also sought to improve the landscape of St. Elizabeth's. In 1883, the District of Columbia Parking Commission donated 500 shade trees to the hospital. And 2 years later, Godding sent a letter to the commission requesting an additional 300 rapidly growing trees to increase the comfort of our people in hot weather. In 1897, Dr. Godding's 25-year-old son, Alva, was hired at $25 per month to work as an assistant superintendent of the grounds. Alva later became superintendent of grounds and served in the position until 1940. Despite his almost lifelong association with the hospital, it is unclear when his interest in botany appeared and when or if he was ever formally trained in school. And here you can see some of these shade trees. During this time period, Godding also allowed a special cottage to be built at the hospital for the sole use of a wealthy patient. In 1886, Sarah Catherine Burroughs was admitted to St. E's with a diagnosis of premature dementia. Katie, as she was known, was the 32-year-old daughter of a wealthy Washingtonian family. The hospital did accept paying patients, and Katie would likely have had a private room in the center building. Both of Sarah's siblings had died before she was born, and she had no immediate family other than her parents. Her father, Joseph, was a native Washingtonian and prominent doctor and died in 1889. Katie's mother, Catherine, met with Dr. Godding to make arrangements for Katie's long-term care. Catherine lived in the cottage prior to her death in 1898. The arrangement with Dr. Godding was a donation of the building and $5,000 to care for Katie in her remaining years. Katie died in 1917, and the cottage was turned over to the hospital. During Katie's time at St. E's, it seems from correspondence between Dr. Godding and the Secretary of Interior that Godding saw an opportunity to house additional patients with means in the cottage, leaving open government beds. There is, however, no documentation that other patients lived in the cottage with Katie or subsequently after. Godding also continued to expand the campus, pushing Congress to appropriate funds to purchase land adjacent to the earlier acquisition of the Stevens Farm, arguing the need for further farmland to produce food for the patients. In 1891, Congress agreed to the appropriation of $20,000 to purchase Oxon Manor, about 3 miles south of the hospital, and named it Godding's Croft. Today, the property is known as Ox Hill Farm and is run by the National Park Service. Godding is, and most of the medical community was not a fan of using the use of patent medicines at that time. And the development and use of drugs in the treatment of the mentally ill was pretty scattershot by today's standards. Methods of treatment such as hydrotherapy also began during Godding's time at the hospital. It consisted of cold and hot baths and showers, followed by tightly swaddling patients in sheets and blankets. The intent was to subdue disturbed patients or provide drowsiness to calmer patients. Success of the treatment was limited to its immediate effects after its application. It is unlikely that the therapy provided any long-term cumulative benefit. Among some of the other forward-thinking steps taken under Godding was the hiring of a dentist in 1886 and the creation of a nursing school in 1894. One of Godding's most important personal actions was the appointment of Dr. Isaac W. Blackburn as special pathologist in 1884. Blackburn, who had trained in pathological and microscopic work in Philadelphia, was hired to perform autopsies and to devote his whole time to the study of the changes wrought by the pathological appearance left behind by insanity. Godding set up shop in the Rest building. Godding had high hopes for important results from the Blackburn's laboratory. Within the first year, it conducted 50 post-mortem exams and began to make headway in the understanding of the pathology of the mentally ill. During the time Godding was superintendent, the patient population at St. Elizabeth's rose from 765 to close to 2,000. By the time he died in 1899, he had erected 22 buildings, introduced more scientific methods of treatment, dramatically changed the physical look of the hospital campus, and laid the groundwork for future development. I turned this sideways so that you could get a little more of an idea of how the campus is oriented, this being north, heading this way. You can see the arrow here. You can see the different hospital buildings that were built, and also on the east campus here, the farm, the agricultural complex. And this is the Stevens farm that was mentioned earlier. President William McKinley appointed Alonzo Richardson, superintendent of St. Elizabeth's in September of 1899. Richardson's goal for the hospital expansion was not merely to relieve the overcrowding. He also intended for the new facilities to help propel the hospital into the 20th century by allowing them to keep fully abreast with the requirements of modern and enlightened care for the insane. You can see here on the map the amount of development that took place during this time. Although St. Elizabeth's had often been at the forefront of mental health care, its Victorian facilities were not in keeping with the modern approach of hospital medical staff desired to take. The hospital expansion would allow St. Elizabeth's to become the model it once was, rather than dragging behind the inadequate provision, antiquated method and equipment, unbecoming, unwieldy, and disappointing in a result, as Richardson said. With the new building underway, Richardson undertook steps to make sure that the hospital's operations and methods kept up with modern and scientific approaches to understanding and caring for the mentally ill. In 1900, Congress appropriated almost $1 million for the extension of the hospital. This was the largest building campaign on the campus since the construction of the original hospital building. The hospital held a design competition, and 6 architectural firms were invited to submit a front and side elevation and principal floor plan for each proposed building, as well as a site plan that would show how the buildings in context. 3 of the 5 firms that responded were from the Washington region: Marsh and Peter, Appleton P. Clark, and Wyatt and Knowlting of Baltimore. The other 2 were from little further afield, Boring and Tilton in New York City, and Yost and Packard in Columbus, Ohio. After reviewing the 5 submissions, the selection panel notified the Secretary of Interior that none of the plans met with their complete approval. The Secretary recommended that the panel invite 2 additional firms to participate: McKim, Mead & White of New York and Shepley, Rutan & Coolidge of Boston. McKim, Mead & White chose not to participate. Richardson notified Shepley, Rutan & Coolidge that they had been selected. The original scope set forth in the competition invitation called for 24 new buildings and extensions to the toner building, an enlarged boiler plant, and all utility connections to the new buildings, as well as to toner and oak buildings that I had shown you previously. As the hospital building committee worked with the architects, the number of the new buildings dropped from 24 to 15. It is hard to know whether some requirements were discarded by the building committee or whether the designers were able to combine many functions more efficiently in fewer buildings. The number of the new buildings remained in flux until February 1901, when this hospital was still considering as many as 17 new buildings. Shepley, Rutan & Coolidge recommended that the hospital consult with landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. with regard to the location and arrangement of the proposed buildings on the site, as well as the hospital's existing layout and landscaping in general. The Olmsted report made 2 principal recommendations. One had to do with the arrangement of existing buildings and the other with the location of the new buildings. Olmsted noted that various non-patient uses that cluttered the landscape at the rear of the center building and adjacent to the cottage group Kitchens and other service buildings, the firehouse and the morgue, were too close to patient wards and made the area immediately south of the center building less than ideal for patient use. Olmsted suggested that some of the support structures must be moved to lessen their intrusion into patient areas. The other recommendation ultimately proved impossible to follow. Olmsted visited the site, and there was a possibility that the hospital would acquire a tract of land owned by Major T. Wilson, known as Wilson Park. And that is the area that is located just over to this area that was between the campus and Stevens Farm. Olmsted believed that this was the best location for the proposed new buildings. If the Wilson Park site wasn't available, the only alternative would have been to build some of the new treatment and residential buildings on hospital property on the east side of Nichols Avenue. Nichols is right here, East Campus, over to the above the picture frame. Richardson believed that expansion onto the East Campus would be untenable and explained that the hospital would need to build an expensive subway system to move patients because they could not cross the road safely. There was also concern about extending water and heat to the East Campus. Congress declined to appropriate the funds necessary to purchase Wilson Park, so Richardson resigned to the buildings moving to the East Campus. Bids for construction of the proposed expansion were opened in summer of 1901, and all of them were significantly over the $900,000 budget for the project. To save money, the building committee decided to temporarily forego construction of the administration building and the tunnel to connect the west and east campuses beneath Nichols Avenue. Most of the construction work was nearing completion by the fall of 1903, including the administration building that had originally been put on hold. Here you can see patients digging foundations on the left. So they utilized a lot of the patient labor here on campus. Besides the new buildings and advances in medical care, the biggest modernization project was the construction of a railroad siding which linked to the B&O's trestle on the hospital's riverfront on the to the campus power plant. In 1901, the hospital purchased a locomotive engine for $1,950. This was considered more economical and convenient than relying on third-party carriers who charged 20 cents a ton for delivery freight cars. Delivery freight cars to come up the switch. In addition to using it for delivery of coal to the boiler plant, the hospital staff relied on the switch for the delivery of materials and heavy goods needed in construction of the hospital expansion, which was then in the final stages of planning and design. As the Shepley-Rutan and Coolidge expansion brought patient care facilities to every part of the West Campus, it became necessary to relocate most agricultural functions to the East Campus and the two hospital out farms. The architects designed a new stable for the East Campus near the dairy barns. This building still stands today. Richardson's tenure at St. Elizabeth's was short-lived. He only served less than 4 years. He died unexpectedly in 1903. And at that time, he had successfully secured a large appropriation from Congress for the massive expansion. Richardson, of course, oversaw the choice of the architect, the design process, and the layout and construction of 15 new buildings, all while organizing the existing facilities. Although the new buildings were not completed until after his death, the work was far enough along to credit this expansion to Richardson. And you can see this 1900 plan for new construction where you can see the expansion to the East Campus here and here. These are we refer to them as the lettered buildings. So you can see the A, B, C on this particular plan. Dr. William White took over from Richardson's unexpected death in 1903 and inherited this building campaign. However, the hospital didn't have the funds to make them inhabitable. So while they were almost completed, they just didn't have much finishings. Once completed, the new buildings would provide state-of-the-art facilities for the care of the mentally ill and bring a more formal sense of order to the hospital campus. Although the original design for the center building, the original hospital had a formal bearing, later additions and detached cottages were placed wherever they could put them. The cottage buildings in particular, although built to relate to one another, presented a rather haphazard visual effect. In contrast, the layout of the new buildings were pure order. Instead of clutter of the Victorian cottages, Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge buildings were placed parallel to Nichols Avenue, forming a central quadrangle on the west campus and a forecourt or front lawn on the east campus. The neoclassical architecture of the new buildings also stood in contrast to the design of the already existing buildings. Until the 1902 expansion, the buildings constructed at St. Elizabeth's were institutional in scale, were designed in a more residential feeling. Doors and window sizes, building materials, wooden porches were all representative of a pared down Victorian style that would have felt familiar to patients and staff alike. The new buildings were far grander in scale. Although most were only 2 stories tall, their style and the scale of their features make them to seem much more imposing. They have large arched windows with broad expanses of glass, prominent entrances, large integrated porches, and expansive day rooms with high ceilings and grand fireplaces, all set the new buildings apart from their predecessors. The Renaissance revival style employed in these buildings was also considerably more detailed and refined. Although built of red brick, like most other buildings on campus, the new buildings had limestone detailing and tile roofs that added to their formal and imposing appearance. The administrative building that you can see to the right on this slide was prominently centered on the new West Campus quadrangle and had a particularly grand 2-story entrance portico supported by limestone columns. Buildings B and C flanking the new administration building were used as receiving wards for male and female patients, respectively. With dedicated receiving buildings for the first time, the medical staff was better able to keep newly admitted undiagnosed patients and those with acute cases separated from chronic cases. The placement of patient care buildings on the East Campus also allowed the staff to separate the more violent male patients from the rest of the population and to place the male patient laborers closer to their jobs. With the development of these new buildings, a new power source needed to be built. In 1904, the power plant and 1 smokestack was completed. As more power became necessary over the years, the building was expanded and a 2nd smokestack was added. Not long after the hospital expansion, the monumental character of the new quad on the West Campus was reinforced with the construction of Hitchcock Hall that was completed in 1910. Situated on the north end of the broad lawn between the Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge buildings, the 1,200-seat, it was referred to as an amusement hall, but it's really a theater, provided the 4th side of the quad, but also screened the new development from the older buildings. With a dramatic front entrance and graceful terracotta decoration, it is arguably the grandest building on campus. The basement of Hitchcock Hall housed the psychodrama program, which started at St. Elizabeth's in February of 1941, which was the 2nd such program in the country. We talk about how grand these buildings are on the outside, the interiors were not as grand. And as you can see from the image on the right, the interior of the theater was quite straightforward with its white walls and dark seating. The only portion of this particular building that had much decor is the lobby area, which has a green marble. The completion of the expansion also allowed the hospital to rearrange and rationalize the uses of the older patient buildings. White followed through on recommendations that Frederick Olmsted Jr. had made to Dr. Richardson for rationalizing the use of land behind the center building. In 1905, the firehouse was moved away from the center building and the morgue, the rest, was moved, which also known as the rest, was moved away from the dining hall. And you can see the foundation here, center building in the background, machine shops, firehouse over here. And this is the rest building that would be moved to this direction. White's hiring of Dr. Mary O'Malley in 1905 was indicative of his desire to bring St. Elizabeth's into the 20th century. In her new position, O'Malley had general oversight of all female patients, as well as the direct care of certain insane cases and surgical work. There's no doubt that O'Malley's appointment was a step forward for the hospital and for female physicians in general, but it didn't inoculate her from the effects of the gender mores of the era. By all accounts, she was given responsibilities equal to male doctors and stepped in from time to time as acting superintendent. Yet in the early days, almost every mention of O'Malley in the annual reports just qualifies her as the title of woman physician. Throughout his tenure as superintendent, White encouraged his staff to be active in research, teaching, and professional circles. Soon after coming to St. Elizabeth's, he instituted a practice of weekly meetings of the doctors to review important patient cases, present journal articles, and discuss the subjects of scientific natures. In 1917, over 825 cases were brought before the staff conferences that they had. White was also determined to improve the nurses' training school and to increase the number of qualified nurses assigned to wards. In 1908, only 43 of the 86 wards were overseen by nurses, with the balance under the oversight of attendants untrained in nursing. That same year, the training school graduated 5 male nurses and 12 female nurses, which was typical for the school. But White hoped to increase those numbers, particularly the number of male graduates. White began his own building campaign in 1908. For many years, appropriation for major construction projects was largely unfilled. Many other smaller projects kept the hospital staff and appropriators busy. In 1913, 5 cottages were built for patients with tuberculosis. Built of wood frame and stucco, 3 of the buildings were for male patients and were placed along the ravine behind the 1902 Richardson group of buildings on the East Campus. 2 other cottages were erected for female patients on the south side of the West Campus. And here you can see an elevation of those buildings. In 1921, Congress appropriated $18 million to improve accommodations for disabled veterans of World War I. Of that amount, $6 million was available for extending existing facilities. Arguably one of the most important buildings constructed during White's building campaign was the Blackburn Laboratory on the East Campus. While the original pathology lab on the West Campus was the first of its kind at a mental institution in the 1880s, by the 1920s it was long out of date. With a newly equipped lab in 1924, the hospital once again could develop clinical and research projects that had practically come to a standstill due to the physical limitations of the previous situation. A few years later, the old rest building, that was the laboratory and morgue on the West Campus, was turned into the circulating library on the main floor of the hospital museum. The opening of the new Blackburn Laboratory on the East Campus was a major step in advancing the scientific work of St. Elizabeth's and helped keep the hospital at the forefront of study of anatomical and scientific aspects of mental illness. In 1931, ground was broken for a permanent tuberculosis building on the south end of the Richardson Group. The $190,000 building was to have 80 beds and be the first step in a new $2 million building program. At this time in 1932, the hospital had 1,700 patients it was 1,700 patients over capacity. Some capacity relief came in 1933 with the opening of 2 continuing treatment or CT buildings and a central kitchen. Each of the CT buildings was 2 stories and had a capacity for 164 patients. They were quickly followed in 1934 by the construction of receiving buildings that would house about 400 male patients. And in 1936, a similar female receiving building was added. Together, they formed what became known as the Maple Quadrangle. White died in 1937, and he managed to add about 1,100 new beds in about 6 years, with another 1,000 completed within 6 years of his death. Between the expansion in 1902 and White's building campaign, little agricultural land remained to produce the majority of the hospital's fresh food. The hospital's livestock operations continued to prove useful well into the 1930s. In 1931, the henneries on the East Campus were still producing eggs, and they had a lot of success with their livestock. However, it made the hospital the enemy of the now suburban neighborhood of Congress Heights. By 1965, the hospital's farming activities had ceased. White served St. Elizabeth's for 34 years, and while his building campaign and medical advancements were impressive, one change during White's tenure reflected his desire to educate the public about how the hospital had changed. In 1904, 1905, and 1914, White had requested that Congress remove the word insane from the name of the hospital, which was still officially the government hospital for the insane. White felt that the word was insane wasn't in keeping with the nature of the hospital's mission and reinforced popular misconceptions that the hospital was a warehouse for the mentally ill. Finally, in 1916, Congress not only removed the word insane from the name, but changed it entirely to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. In doing so, Congress officially codified the nickname for the hospital in popular use since the Civil War, but it did so without the possessive apostrophe. Now, that possessive apostrophe does not show up on the original land grant for this tract plan. So it was named for St. Elizabeth, and it did not have an apostrophe, so it kept the tradition. Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Dr. Winfred Overholser to lead the hospital in 1937. And you can see here where he continued the CT campus. Overholser set to work overseeing the hospital's building program, and in 1938 and 39, while continuing treatment buildings 3, 4, 5, and 6, which were in various stages of completion, construction, and planning. And you can see this aerial view of the completed CT complex, and temporary buildings that had not yet been torn down. Temporary buildings. Overholser had also made efforts to shore up the aging infrastructure of the West Campus. The center building, the original hospital building, which was built in the 1850s, was renovated, and the front entrance was restored. And here are some images of the superintendent's suite during Overholser's time there. He was the last superintendent to take residence in the building. In 1946, the executive branch ended military admissions to St. Elizabeth's entirely, but still allowed for the admission of the insane of the US Coast Guard. In doing so, the government largely ended St. Elizabeth's military affiliation, which it had maintained from its founding. Prior to the transfer of military patients and the discontinuation of military admissions, St. Elizabeth's was nearly 1,300 patients over capacity. At its peak, St. Elizabeth's had 7,529 patients. In 1949, Congress gave approval to demolish Oaks and Toner buildings on the West Campus. Over the years, St. Elizabeth's housed several infamous residents. However, the end of World War II brought American poet Ezra Pound to the campus. Pound, who had lived in Italy during the war and was paid by the Italian government to make anti-US radio broadcasts, was indicted for treason in July of 1943. Pound was captured by US troops in 1945 and flown to Washington to stand trial. At his arraignment, Pound's lawyer asserted that Pound was mentally ill and incompetent to enter a plea. Pound was then admitted to the Gallinger Hospital, where he was examined by 4 doctors, including Overholser, and found by all 4 to be unfit to stand for trial. Rather than release him on bail, the judge was, in the case, ordered that Pound be admitted to St. Elizabeth's to await his sanity hearing. With Overholser as the government's lead witness, having asserted Pound's insanity, it took the jury only a few minutes to reach the verdict that he was of unsound mind. Pound returned to St. Elizabeth's, where he was admitted to Howard Hall, the building reserved for the criminally insane. He was moved to the center building, where he lived until his release a year later. During the 12 years that Pound was at the hospital, he continued his writing and received an impressive array of visitors, including T.S. Eliot, E. Cummings, Thurton Wilder, Catherine Ann Porter, and so on. He is rumored to have had a very friendly relationship with the superintendent and even made the schedule for the tennis courts. The Department of Justice dropped the 19 charges against Pound in 1958, and he returned to Italy, where he marked his arrival in Naples by giving a fascist salute. Overholser continued to correspond with Pound as late as 1963. Other infamous patients included Richard Lawrence, who we discussed earlier, who the attempted assassination of Andrew Jackson in 1835. Charles Guiteau, the assassin of President James Garfield in 1881. He was executed, but stayed at St. Elizabeth's prior to that. And John Hinckley Jr., who attempted the assassination on Ronald Reagan in 1981. Hinckley was released in 2016 to live with his mother in Williamsburg, Virginia. The combination of successful drug therapies and a greater focus on patient freedom allowed new concepts of patient care to emerge over the years. Great stress was placed on the social rehabilitation of patients and the reintroduction to society. Large hospitals like St. Elizabeth's were still needed, but the hospital's treatment policy was to decentralize care as much as possible. Beginning in the 1960s, the district tried to gain control of the hospital from the federal government. An agreement was not reached until 1984 that assured the transfer of the hospital in 1987 and also provide federal subsidies through 1991. In an elaborate ceremony in 1987, the East Campus and the responsibility for all the hospital's functions was transferred to the district. Mayor Marion Barry said at the time that it was an important event, not only for mental health, but also for the city's efforts to advance home rule. Despite the celebration, the hospital continued to have major problems and lost its accreditation in 1988. As the financial outlook in the district brightened in the late 1990s, the nature of the patient care continued to evolve. The hospital's prospects began to brighten, and ground was broken on a new hospital building. In 2010, the DC Department of Mental Health opened a new hospital building in the southeast corner of the East Campus. With a patient capacity of 293, the new building is only slightly larger than the original 250-bed hospital Dorothea Dix and Charles Nichols envisioned in the 1850s. In the 1984 agreement, DC was given until 1991 to come up with a plan for the West Campus, or it would revert to the federal government. In 2001, the Department of Health and Human Services, which had jurisdiction over the West Campus, declared that it was access to the department's needs. The site was transferred to the U.S. General Services Administration in 2004. When GSA took control of the West Campus, it stabilized the 66 buildings still standing on the site and began making plans for its future. In 2008, GSA issued a master plan for the West Campus, which called for 4.5 million square feet of office to be built for a consolidated headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. This would also entail having 14,000 federal workers be located at the site. Ground was broken in 2010 for the first phase of the DHS project, which centered on the new headquarters building for the United States Coast Guard, and includes the rehabilitation and reuse of Atkins Hall, the detached dining hall and kitchen, and the shops buildings. So you can see here is where the Coast Guard building is. The shops are here, and the detached dining hall here. We're all part of the rehabilitation. DHS had intended to fully occupy the site by 2018, but at this time, we're in a consolidated consolidation is underway with a new amendment to the master plan that may result in the demolition of additional historic buildings. What you're seeing here on this recommended plan is the development of these buildings here that you see. This is the power plant that my cursor is on now, and it would result in the demolition of, I believe, 5 of the buildings that are on the plateau of the Shepley-Rutan Coolidge buildings. In 2012, the District of Columbia Department of Planning issued a master plan for the East Campus. The district's master plan involves the opening of the East Campus to the community and the region for the first time. And the plan calls for new mixed-use neighborhoods that would include retail, office, open space, and cultural amenities. The chapel that is on campus has been converted to a technology lab, and there is an entertainment complex that is home to the women's basketball team, Washington Mystics. Several residential buildings are in development as well. To get more information, obviously there's a tremendous amount of history on this particular site. These 2 websites will lead you to a tremendous amount of information, especially if you're interested in a particular building. The General Services Administration conducted historic structure reports on all of the buildings on the West Campus, and each report averages a size of 33 to 50 pages. So you can read the entire history and see additional photographs that come along with it. Also, with the St. Elizabeth East campus plans, you can see where they stand at this point as they continue to develop that campus. And so now I'm ready for questions.
Okay, that was great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Okay, we have a couple of questions from folks. And again, as a reminder, everybody, if you have like a follow-up question to the question that you typed in, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. Because sometimes it's just easier to ask verbally. But here we have a question from Amy. Amy asked, why was Richardson successful in getting the appropriation for the sizable expansion, new buildings in the quadrangle? What argument did he make? Was it function or aesthetics?
I think like anything else, it was likely probably the right place at the right time. We don't have any definitive information on that, or at least I don't at this time. We can certainly look into that further, but I would imagine like anything else, certain appropriations come when it's someone or some legislator's pet project.
And then Anne asked, are there going to be any more patient care facilities on the campus, or has all that been relocated elsewhere or closed down? And that kind of goes along with another question that we got from Julian, which was, can you like please point out on a map of the campus, like which buildings are still used to house and treat patients?
Okay, so let's see here. So patient facilities are now located on the hospital campus. You can see where my pointer is here. So all the St. Elizabeth Hospital functions are consolidated into this new building that was built in 2010. All of the rest of these buildings that you see on the campus are utilized. So this is just the East Campus. This is the hospital complex here. This is all the mixed use facility now that is being redeveloped as part of, that the District of Columbia is redeveloping. This is the West Campus here. These are the administrative buildings.
Great. Elizabeth asked, did patients come from all over the country?
This hospital was specifically for residents of the District of Columbia and those who were in military service. So the only point when there were individuals from other parts of the country was during the Civil War.
Okay. Let's see, we have a couple more questions.
Oh, I did, of course, I can also mention that I did read in certain circumstances where they did have certain criteria for individuals being admitted. And there were times that the superintendent would bend the rules for a friend or colleague that asked for it. So there were at times other patients from Maryland or Virginia, but typically it was a favor for a friend.
Somebody asked kind of a follow-up question, I guess, to give more details of like what some of the original buildings are being used for, in addition to the ones that you had pointed out, Rebecca.
Okay, certainly. So the center building here is now the Secretary's office for the Department of Homeland Security. They started occupying that in 2018. These are the shop buildings here. These are now utilized as a gymnasium, it's not a PX, so goods and services that the Coast Guard employees and DHS employees on campus utilize. This building right here is the mortuary. That's used as the GSA field office. This is the dining hall. So that's the original dining hall on campus, and it's reused as the dining hall. And this building here is utilized for the credit union and the historian for the Coast Guard. So those are the buildings that are currently in use.
Great.
And also the gatehouse here at Gate 1 has been rehabbed and is in use at this point as a gatehouse.
Jim wanted to know, the point about like digging foundations, but I guess also when it came to the patients working on the campus in general, maybe. Was it voluntary or and was it considered therapeutic or simply cost saving?
I think it was both. It was definitely, they used work therapy throughout. They did have heavy laborers, and they also, especially when they established the farm at Oxon Hill, the goal for that was actually to establish a colony of workers to work down there. So they wouldn't necessarily stay on the hospital grounds. They would stay down at Goddings Croft. And so this was part of the therapy. They also did gardening. There were orchards on the campus, obviously farming with the herds, chicken coops, piggeries, pigeon. There was a pigeon nest of some sort, the stables. And so I believe some of it was to, earn your keep. A lot of it was paid for by the District of Columbia. There were some self-paying patients here as well, as I mentioned. But I'm not sure about the voluntary nature of certain things. I think a lot of it was encouraged from a therapeutic perspective.
So Susan asks, do like the cemeteries still exist and what is the plan for them? I guess both the East and West Campus ones.
So the cemetery on the West Campus is located right here where you see my cursor. It is within the perimeter fencing of the West Campus and the Department of Homeland Security site. There is access offered if someone can prove some kind of relation to someone that's buried there. General Services Administration at this point is responsible for the maintenance of that particular cemetery. There are 2 other cemeteries on the East Campus that are maintained by the District of Columbia.
Okay. And then Julian asked, when DC took over the East Campus, did the federal government and the West Campus immediately relinquish its role in care for the mentally ill patients?
So the District of Columbia, when it took over the East Campus in 1987, they were still being subsidized by the federal government until 1991. And so DC actually took control of both sides of the campus, but because DC did not have a plan for the West Campus, it reverted to the federal government in 1991.
Okay.
But after 1991, the East Campus was not subsidized by the federal government.
I think we have a follow-up question from Lance. So I'm going to unmute you, Lance, and you could ask your question. You might have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, my immigrant grandfather was in the Russian army in World War I and emigrated to New York in 1918, relocated to Cleveland, and abandoned his family in 1929 in Cleveland. Was not heard from again until 1964 when my father was notified of his father's death at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in February 1964. We don't know how he got there, but understood he as an Allied veteran, he was entitled to services and was buried in an unmarked grave in Congressional Cemetery. Are patient records available anywhere? That's about all I know about my grandfather.
There are patient records at the National Archives. They have a tremendous number of them. Typically, they do not become public for 75 years. However, in this case, if you're able to prove some kind of lineage, they may be able to make some kind of exception. But yes, the National Archives and Records Administration has a tremendous number of the records from St. Elizabeth's.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
A lot of great questions. Laura asks, how are patients admitted to St. E's? Where can we find more about the treatments used at the hospital? I guess you cover that, Rebecca.
Well, you can, so the treatments, so at the new hospital, as I mentioned, it's at less than 300 beds at this point. And so there are obviously individuals who are sent there by the courts. And it's not a large hospital. And today with the pharmaceuticals that are available, people are not typically held for long-term care. There's lots of different options. I think if you go to the St. Elizabeth's Hospital website for the campus, they can give you a little bit more information about their admittance criteria at this point, and how many patients they have there and the number of beds and whatnot. And also in the new hospital building, there is several of the doctors who were instrumental in developing the new hospital building. They produced a museum at the entranceway of the new hospital building of patient artifacts that had been collected over the years and things like that. So there's a number of physicians on staff that are very interested in the history of the hospital.
Okay, so we kind of have two similar questions. One, I guess, is kind of asking to give a little bit more information about like how DCPL is kind of actively working with the campus to preserve the campus, kind of like what our role is in that. And if we have like any other information about like proposed new buildings or like certain work that is being done on the campus.
So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, DCPL participates as a consulting party. So we have meetings with the team that is redeveloping let's see here, the West Campus of the property. And most recently, these particular demolitions and this concept, the amendment to the master plan, went before the National Capital Planning Commission. So under the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the federal government does these consultations. They don't actually have to listen to the groups. I mean, GSA's goal is to have design excellence and to preserve these buildings. They are stewards of this historic property, but they also have a mandate to, there's a purpose and need is what it's called for the campus, which is to consolidate the Department of Homeland Security on this particular campus. Things will likely change given COVID and given these work from home activities that everybody's been doing for the last year. So there will likely be future amendments as well as all of these things are changing. For instance, these buildings along the Nichols Avenue area, so you have the administration buildings and the two other buildings on its side, these buildings are within a blast zone of Nichols Avenue. And so the question of how can they be used, because federal guidelines require a certain number of feet, that you have a certain number of feet from an accessible, a public roadway because of blast conditions. And that changes. So what it was in 2005 when we started this consultation is now different in 2020. So it's an ongoing consultation that will likely last the majority of my career. And so that's how we continue to participate. Our goal is to ensure that most buildings possible are retained, the character of the campus is maintained, and that there is future public access to the site as a National Historic Landmark and as a site that is owned by the people of the United States.
Great. So there's just like a couple of questions, just wondering why a hospital that predominantly treats mental health would start treating TB patients and tuberculosis. Do you have any?
I don't have any insight into that. I'm sorry. It's in the 19th century, there were a number of reasons that people would be in these asylums, and we've had people come on our walking tours where they would tell us that one of their relatives suffered from alcoholism and was at the institution. So people with epilepsy, that kind of thing. So there were a variety of treatments, and I think that this was almost a catch-all for many treatments prior to the onset of drug therapies.
So I think we have a follow-up question from Julian. I'm gonna unmute you, Julian.
Sorry, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, actually, this isn't a follow-up question. It's a different question, more easily put orally than in writing. When DC sought to take over the East Campus, or in fact all of St. Elizabeth, had its population by then decreased to the point where, in fact, at least initially, the East Campus was sufficient to accommodate it? Perhaps you could give some sense of the pacing of the phase down of inpatients there during the 50s or 60s as attempts were made to move people more out into the community.
Yes, it did. The patient decline increased tremendously over the subsequent years after World War II. And it hit the peak of population right after World War II, and then subsequently declined and declined and declined. And as I mentioned earlier, there was, the goals of having people reintegrated into society much more quickly. So people are not necessarily, while they're coming to St. Elizabeth and still come to St. Elizabeth, they're not necessarily staying there for long periods of time. These are acute cases that can be treated. They're not necessarily long haul cases. And so by the 1980s, much of the West Campus had already been abandoned. There were some subsequent offices in different buildings there, but the majority of it had been most of the functions of St. Elizabeth's Hospital had been moved to the East Campus at that point, because those were also the newer buildings.
Thank you.
We have a question from Jim. Is the campus open to the public for walking around and snooping?
The West Campus is not open to the public. The East Campus is. The West Campus is a level 5 secure facility for the Department of Homeland Security. The only access is through public tours, which of course are not taking place at this point. The East Campus is accessible. There is the entertainment facility. There is now residential going in there. There is also the Rise Center, which is in the former 1956 chapel, which is a technology center. They offer programs, technology classes, things like that, and other public programs at the particular chapel. So there is access to the East Campus. There's also a homeless facility on the East Campus as well. The only portion that's inaccessible on the East Campus at this point, really, I mean, there's parts of it that are under construction, but the agricultural complex, which is in this area that you can see on your screen that I'm pointing to, that area is inaccessible as well. That's completely fenced off because the buildings are not inhabited and the stable is not in great condition.
Thank you. So we have a question from Facebook from Sahan, and he asked, what is the current state of the historic gatehouses? Are they being used? I guess in addition to the ones that you identified, Rebecca.
So the historic gatehouses, we have Gatehouse 1 here, which is being utilized, that is staffed. We have Gatehouse 2 here, which is also being utilized. Typically, it's used as an exit in construction traffic. Mostly the main entrance is here. There is a new entrance along this connecting road down here at the bottom of your screen that comes in where this is the garage for the Department of Homeland Security and Coast Guard building. And so there's a gatehouse right here, which is not historic. So there are, at this point, 3 manned gatehouses here on campus, on the West Campus. The East Campus, there are mainly, they're not historic buildings as entrances, but there are manned huts, so to speak.
Great. Let me see if we have, I think we're just about done. We still have some questions here in the Q&A, but I will make a note of those, and then I can pass along to Rebecca, and we can get you those answers. But I also dropped a couple of links into the chat, including one to the St. Elizabeth's tour that we had curated for our app, DC Historic Sites. And on there, there's like additional resources that are linked to each of the sites. So if you did have a question, maybe about more of like the history and stuff, you might want to check that out. You might be able to find some more resources. And with that, Rebecca, did you have any kind of final words or?
Sure. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you found it interesting. This was my first time giving this tour, so we're always happy to have your feedback. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of information on this campus, and there's a lot of information out there, so you can delve deeper into topics that kind of float your boat on these different links that we've offered to you. If you're a member, we really thank you. If you're not a member, we encourage you to join the Preservation League because it's membership dollars that help us move forward and advocate for sites that are special like this one to retain their character and integrity and public access for members. You don't have to be a resident of the District of Columbia. We, as one of our board members says, we accept all tender. So we hope that you'll consider joining the organization, and we hope to see you on a future tour or program, which will have a lot coming up in the coming year as we enter our 50th anniversary. So thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to any of the Q&As. I will get back to you shortly with the answers on those. But thanks again. I really appreciate your time.